In this webinar logic, I think it's my job to provide a bit of a general overview and background to bring you up to speed on what has been happening in the climate negotiations, what are the key topics for the COP28 coming up in just under 2 weeks now, and yeah, basically giving also an insight how the negotiations take place. So a bit more on the practical side of elements, which you won't find in many books or articles. So hopefully also a bit of practical information to find your way around and discover interesting topics and news that you can report on. So what I would like today is to give you a three-part overview. First, starting with the climate negotiations themselves. Why are we actually negotiating and what exactly are we negotiating? And also what has changed in the last over 30 years that the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has been adopted. So the second part will then dive a bit deeper into the three main treaties that we're discussing and that we'll continue to negotiate every year. That is the Framework Convention, that's the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. So I want to give a bit of an insight, and bear with me if it becomes too legalistic, just give me a comment in the chat. I'll try to also see that. And an overview of the Paris Agreement and the key topics to be discussed at the The third part, what I want to close with is the more practical elements that I mentioned, to show these different worlds at a COP that not only collide, but sort of interact with each other and give also different insights. And yeah, meetings, but we'll get to that in a second. First of all, let me start with the overview why we are what are climate negotiations and why are they so important right now? And with a bit of background information, I can really recommend the IPCC assessment report. It's the sixth iteration. It's a regularly appearing assessment report covering all relevant research conducted in the last 6 to 7 years. So it's an international panel, intergovernmental panel on climate change. It's experts. It's not per se negotiations. It's really gathering all the information that currently exists. And there are three different working groups who brought forward their different specific reports on mitigation, on impact adaptation vulnerability, and also on the physical science base of climate change. And it's so important because this year in March, the synthesis report, which you see in the bottom left, was released. So that's summarizing all the different elements and giving also a short version for policymakers. So I can heavily recommend to have a look at that to provide you with a factual basis of international research on climate change. There are 6 messages on that slide, but many more, because all publications you see in the bottom left stuck together are probably half a meter high if you printed them out. But to try to break it down in a nutshell, these 6 messages you see on the slide, that the human effect is confirmed. We are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius on a global mean average above the pre-industrial temperatures. The risks are real. We see them in the news every day across the world, from wildfires to floods, to extreme weather events on many different scales. Once in 100-year events tend to come up now once every 10 years. We have record summers year over year. So the risks are real. And the urgency is also there because climate and greenhouse gases are, well, the greenhouse gas emissions are still on the rise. We might see a small change in the next few years and hope for that. But it is indeed a critical decade until 2030, and we need to turn the wheel around, if you will. It is currently alarming because we also know from the research that the current measures are not sufficient, both in mitigation and adaptation. But there's also some hope, and there are some elements. We have the technologies, we have the knowledge, and we have the awareness that we actually need to turn the wheel around. So there are these options available. Many of them have become more and more cost effective over the last decades. Just to speak of solar or wind energy, there are usually additional use and positive side benefits from them. It's not just the climate impacts that are positive. Just climate action will reduce risk for humans and nature. But it comes, of course, with challenges. It will be required a worldwide action. Also, that's why the climate negotiations on the international scale gather so much attention. But we need the national implementation, the national ambition by every party to the convention and the Paris Agreement to do something about it. So the main key goals that the IPCC outlines that we would actually reduce global emissions until 2030 by half, and actually get to net zero emissions until the half of the century. That's really in a nutshell. I can encourage to dive a bit deeper into the IPCC synthesis report and the deeper reports if you want. But there are already many actions and activities taking place. So what's still for us to do? And this graph is supposed to give you a brief overview. It's from the colleagues at Climate Action Tracker, who update that on a regular basis. This is the latest version from November 2022, including the then submitted nationally determined contributions, so the national climate targets submitted to the international process. It shows that until 2030, that to be in line with the Paris Agreement goals, this 1.5 degree goal mainly, we would need to halve our emissions. You see that on the green line. So we would need a steep decline in global greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see since 1990, from about like 37, I think, gigatons of CO2 per year, we've been actually going up year over year to way over 50 gigatons per year. That means we can estimate now what the current policies and actions in place and the current pledges would change about that. And the small good news is we would actually go beyond below the business as usual. So that is one positive. But it comes with a big caveat, because you can see here on the blue upper area, the policies in action would actually stabilize emissions until 2030, but not reduce them. The pledges and targets, if you take them into consideration, they are all implemented and fulfilled. Looks a bit better. That's a lighter blue shade below. That would actually also get us under the 50 gigatons per year. And there's also a bit of a uncertainty. That's why there's not a single line, but more of a broader stroke with a brush. But again, this leaves us with a sizable gap. And it's specified here on the right-hand side. So even if we take all pledges and targets for granted and the implementation, that it all works out and can be financed, the target gap would still amount to almost 20 gigatons of CO2 per year. And this is sizable, of course, because it adds up year over year. So there is a lot left for us to do. But the international community has been coming together since 1992. That's when the UNF Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. It entered into force 2 years later, 1994. And you can see here also the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had been established before. So the science basis was there before, and then the international community got together and agreed on the UNFCCC. There have been numerous key events in the past. I've picked out a few of them, and you'll see 3 highlighted in deep blue. That's the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. Because those are the international treaties that we have. All of them are still in force, and all are still relevant. We are negotiating still all 3 treaties. So when we talk about the COP, it's actually not just the COP of the UNFCCC, but it's also the governing bodies of the Kyoto Protocol and the governing bodies of the Paris Agreement. I think it's important because sometimes in news websites, you see reporting on most recent COP outcomes and decisions, and it sounds like this would be a new treaty, but that's not the case. We have 3 treaties, those are the main ones, and we have been negotiating decisions under these treaties since they have been in place. You see a few other bullets here. Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009 was actually meant to be a breakthrough. It was an area of a level of high ambition was asked, and a follow-up to the Kyoto Protocol, but unfortunately failed massively. So parties could only agree to a very minimal consensus, and it took a few years to get us back on track and negotiate the Paris Agreement. That's why I see a sad smiley there. I have colleagues who have been in Copenhagen and are still kind of traumatized by these experiences. Regarding the naming of the outcomes of the different COPs, since I pick up the Katowice rulebook because that's where we have key decisions to implement the Paris Agreement. That's again a bundle, if you will, of decisions under the UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol, and Paris Agreement to implement these articles and make them more concise. So an example could be that already the Paris Agreement requires to have nationally determined contributions, but it didn't specify all the details, how they look like, if there's a template, what it contains, and the Katowice rulebook decisions add the substance to these questions, to the reporting system, and a number of other aspects, of course. The Glasgow Climate Pact in 2021 is again a bundle of decisions. There we agreed on common timeframes for the nationally determined contributions, and we also agreed on the market mechanisms to be implemented under the Paris Agreement. And the most recent one was last year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, where we also have sizable discussions, namely on loss and damage, but also the decision to have a just transition work program set up. I'll get to those in a bit. And they have been started last year, these discussions, and now this year we will meet in Dubai with the United Arab Emirates. That's a broad overview of the timeline. If you take anything away, 3 major treaties we are discussing every year. And also, it belongs to the timeline to see a bit how things have changed. Because when the UNFCCC was agreed on in 1992, we did have a very different picture in terms of global emissions than we have now. First of all, emissions were much lower. We've talked about that. But also the distribution of emissions was widely different. In 1990, you could say we had largely OECD countries contributing, US, EU, and a number of others, of course, contributing as major emitters to global greenhouse gas emissions. But ever since, you see that on the right side, emissions from also developing countries in that context have been rising sharply for a number of reasons. Those would be growth of population, those would be growth of economic power, but also growth of production, because many industrialized countries have been outsourcing their productions. And of course, that has led to emissions in other countries as well. You see the graph of China significantly rising and overtaking the US in, I think, 2005. And so the picture that we have now under the discussions of the Paris Agreement is a very different one than we had when the original Framework Convention was agreed upon. That is important, I think, also for journalists to understand why and how these dynamics develop also in the climate negotiations, because we talk a lot about historical emissions, we talk about responsibilities, we talk about who should pay for loss and damages, we talk about who should mitigate more, who needs to provide the means of implementation for adaptation. All these differences come back to who has been emitting how much in the past and how much are they emitting now. And you'll understand just from that graph alone that we couldn't succeed under the Paris Agreement if not all countries would be on board, if it's just the developed countries. That's a terminology of the UNFCCC. Bear with me, I'm aware it should be a global north, global south discussion, but the legal terms are still developed country and developing country. So we need all developed and developing countries on board to make a difference in modern times. But of course, the question is legitimate. Who has been creating the main share of greenhouse gas emissions in the last century? And that is clearly the developed countries. But also part of the picture is, this is the per country emissions you see here. The next slide shows the per capita emissions. And here it's a question of justice and equity also to discuss how much should a single person be allowed to emit, or how do we talk about the responsibilities? And here you see a much more diverse picture. And even though, for instance, the US per capita emissions have been substantially declining, they are still the highest globally, and still sometimes double, sometimes even triple or quadruple the numbers of many other countries. But also here you see that the Chinese per capita emissions have been growing substantially and have surpassed, for instance, the EU's average per capita emissions. It's even more relevant, of course, if you take into consideration that the EU 27 is, I think, 450 to 500 million people, whereas China is, of course, manifold times that. So that just exacerbates the problem, but is an important part to the narrative and discussion also during the negotiations. Let me dive now a bit more into the second part. That would be the question, what do the different treaties cover and what are key elements to be discussed at the COP? Let us start with the UNFCCC. It's a landmark because it actually acknowledges for the first time that change in the Earth's climate and its adverse effects are a common concern of humankind. So that is already in 1992, the agreed language and something we've been building on ever since. And the UNFCCC still is one of the key elements that we're discussing. It hasn't been replaced by the Paris Agreement, but complemented and added on in different elements. Because it also sets up a reporting system we still have in place. So this requires for the first time that parties to the convention have greenhouse gas inventories. So we actually know how much is being emitted. And that is actually quite tricky because you need a lot of manpower and monitoring to measure that. It's a lot of different categories going through all economic sectors, also transport, also housing. There's all the different sectors that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and the inventories allow to have a globally comparable overview. So the inventories are still a key aspect. Also introduced regular reporting. Here the reporting standards and requirements were stronger for developed countries, a little less stronger for developing countries. And the Paris Agreement also overhauled the reporting, which will start next year. But also why we are discussing this today and at the COP, the UNFCCC provides the institutional framework. It's a framework convention. So we have 3 individual treaties, which are all equally legally on the same status. But the framework convention created these institutions that the other treaties are borrowing. So this would be the conference of the party, the COP. That is not only the meeting, as we call it, then in December, in November and December, but it's also the actual governing body of the convention. The Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement follow the same logic and system. The UNFCCC also has a secretariat. Its seat is in Bonn. That's where we do the preparation negotiations every June, where the secretariat seat is. It created also subsidiary bodies to delegate the work and also allow for negotiations between these COPs. Those would be the SBI and the SUBSTA, the subsidiary body for implementation, and the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. It also created a financial mechanism that also the other treaties are borrowing and using in to a different extent, and we'll get to the content a bit later. So when you see the different abbreviations, and most of you might be familiar with them already, but these 3 governing bodies are for 3 different treaties I outlined. So the COP is for the UNFCCC, the CMP is for the Kyoto Protocol, and the CMA for the Paris Agreement. There are some items that we are negotiating which belong to 2 governing bodies and under 2 conventions. So there are some examples. I could name, for instance, action for climate empowerment, which includes participation, education, awareness, international cooperation. That would be an item that we discuss under the COP and under the CMA as a shared item. So there are some overlaps indeed, but it's always useful to be also specific when we are reporting because not all parties are exactly the same. Under the COP, we have 197 parties in the EU. In Paris, we have 194. The subsidiary bodies, SUBSTA and SBI, I just mentioned, they work under the guidance of all 3 governing bodies. So a SUBSTA or SBI decision could take on the work and fulfill or deliver decision drafts, for instance, for any of these 3 bodies. So that really becomes clear from the mandate. I'll just outline that so you have an understanding when you enter the COP rooms and find an item where you listen in, that you can somewhat structure on which level that belongs. I want to go a bit deeper into the Paris Agreement, and bear with me, you don't have to read all of this. I think we'll make the presentation also available to the participants later. This is a graphic and overview I adapted from colleagues of mine who worked on that, Rolf Bodel and Lena Donat and Matthias Duwe, who created that in 2016 for a German agency. And it's supposed to show you the key structure of the Paris Agreement. I won't go into every detail here, but happy to answer any questions later. Key purpose, that's what we're discussing, are the mitigation, adaptation, and finance flows, which you see at the very top. Mitigation purpose, the goal includes the 2 and 1.5 degree goals, but also greening all finance flows and increasing efforts on adaptation are all part of the purpose of the Paris Agreement. The individual articles then dive into these different sectors in more detail. So you'll see mitigation, adaptation, all the means of implementation elements like finance, technology transfer, capacity building, and the key part also reporting, which is here called transparency. On the right top part, you see also additional key elements in market mechanisms under Article 6, loss and damage, the LND here, in Article 8, action for climate empowerment, which I just mentioned before in Article 12, etc. And at the very bottom, you see the Global Stocktake. This is going to be one of, if not the key deliverable at COP28 this year. Under all these different articles, negotiation streams have been ongoing since the Paris Agreement has been ratified and entered into force in 2016. So the Stocktake we have now is going to be the first one that really builds on all the information and all the negotiations we have done since. We had a 2018 precursor, which started some dialogue session, but we have nothing like the Global Stocktake just yet. So this is the first iteration, and also main reason why the attention of at this COP is so high. So all these inputs will feed into the Global Stocktake, and for the last 18 months, we have been gathering information in different technical dialogues, and now the outputs of the Global Stocktake will be negotiated, and we'll see how ambitious the outcome will be. So the Stocktake is going to be a key deliverable. We'll also discuss loss and damage. If you think about the terminology, mitigation is trying to avoid emissions. Adaptation is adapting to the impact of climate change. And loss and damage is after that, basically, if losses and damages have already occurred, how they can be compensated or at least eased, the burden can be eased. So loss and damage will be a key deliverable also at this COP, because last year the COP decided to add a loss and damage fund. And there has been a transitional committee meeting 5 times this year alone over, I think, overall 30 days to pre-negotiate how this loss damage fund could fit into the existing funding structures, what it could entail, who could contribute to this, who would be beneficiary from that. So this will be finalized at the COP, but we have a draft now by this transitional committee. So loss and damage will be also a key deliverable. The third one and fourth, I'll highlight briefly because, of course, we'll continue to talk about mitigation. This is key for many developed countries because our emissions are still too high. So we'll talk about NDC and ambition. Adaptation, of course, is always a key aspect, particularly last year in the African COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. Was an adaptation focused COP. So there we'll discuss, of course, global goal on adaptation and many sub aspects. Finance is a key aspect for many countries because many don't have the capacities to finance the transitions on their own. But we'll also discuss greening all finance flows. So we have both elements, the purpose to 1C, that would be the greening all finance flows. That's what all countries have to do. And Article 9, which you see just below that, is on finance. And Article 9 talks about developed countries providing finance to developing countries to assist them. And there's also an element I mentioned before, some yeah, you can also start items which fit under the convention or the Paris Agreement, even though they haven't been discussed before. So we'll have the Just Transition Work Program discussed because the COP last year decided to follow up on that aspect. So that will be also one of the things to watch. But of course, if you're a journalist who focuses on capacity building or on reporting or on education or market mechanisms, all of these items will be negotiated as well, but they will be usually flying a bit under the radar. So the main narrative and the main measure of success for many outlets is usually how we deliver on the global stocktake, on loss and damage, on finance, etc. Here I've just grouped them again in a different format, so it's easier for you to recapitulate. I just want to add on the first bullet point that the political pressure and the expectation are very high again, because again, the IPCC assessment report has been released, so it's clear what we need to do and that we're falling short of the required measures at this point. It's the first global stocktake taking place. And of course, throughout the year, we've seen climate extremes, or extreme weather events, also due to the changing climate. That will put a lot of pressure on negotiators and states to deliver. But if I may, I will just add on that perspective from a negotiator side. I think it's very difficult to live up to the extremely high expectations year over year, because in many media reports I've read, at least in the past years, it's always the one COP to turn it around, the one COP to solve all the problems. And that's never going to happen. The expectation is a bit too high because the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC are key elements. It's the forum where all parties and all states come together to discuss this. It's also the key forum to set signals, but it's not the only forum where we discuss climate change and its impact. If you talk about the G7 summits, the G20 summits, that's also where we talk about subsidies for fossil fuels. We talk about global recovery programs. We have the International Trade Organization. We have the International Maritime Organization for marine transport. We have ICAO for international aircraft operators. So there are all these different sectoral treaties and programs and meetings taking place throughout the year, and also working towards a more climate just world, if you will. So the Paris Agreement is a key part of the puzzle, but it's not the only one. And I think that's sometimes gets a bit lost in some of the high-level reporting when you read about whether or not a COP was a success, because it's about also national implementation throughout the year and all these different other elements and all other fora to contribute as well. This would be if you would ask me like which slide to remember, this would be the second one. The first one would be that we have 3 treaties that we're negotiating. And this is the logic of the Paris Agreement and why it differs from the previous treaties. You see here the national level on the top line, the NDC submission, the nationally determined contributions, and then the international level on the bottom line with the stocktakes. So that is the ratchet up mechanism of the NDC cycle that the Paris Agreement introduced. So the logic is that nation states, member states, parties to the Paris Agreement prepare their own climate goals on the national level, what they can contribute. It should be as ambitious as possible. Those will be gathered. That's when it goes down to the international level, to the stocktakes. And you'll see here for 2023, the first global stocktake. And this should then inform how we're doing globally. That should inform the national level again to increase the national ambition for the next NDC cycle. So we're thinking in 5-year cycles. It seems very short in the international term, but looking at the rapid climate developments and rising emissions, it's actually not that short term because it's a very low turnover every 5 years. So in the past years, the parties have discussed and negotiated how to make the increase of mitigation ambition even bigger, starting with here now some high-level ministerials started last year. So we'll have annual roundtables to discuss progress, to discuss ambition, the opportunities to increase the ambition in the national NDCs. So there's an additional layer of discussion rounds apart from just having the NDC updates every 5 years. And starting this year, we agreed last year on a mitigation work program to go until 2026, which adds global dialogue specifically on mitigation and also investment-focused events to broaden the scope and also include more stakeholders. So that is hopefully somewhat understandable. I'll see if there's any question in the chat so far. That doesn't seem to be the case. Okay. So continuing, what is next on the agenda? So this year's agenda is packed. This will be very, very intense and very, very busy. I've mentioned the Global Stocktake, the loss and damage funding arrangements, continuation of the work program on mitigation, creation of a new just transition work program. So there will be our work cut out and we'll be very busy. And the next year, we'll expect the first round of reporting under the Paris Agreement. Those are the biannual transparency reports. Apologies for all these acronyms, otherwise they wouldn't fit on the slide. So we have had reporting under the UNFCCC for these last 30 years, but now we have also the framework in place under Paris, and the first round of reports are due next year. There will be also some other items that I'm particularly working on, also local communities, indigenous people platform, the LCIPP will be reviewed, working on their work plan currently, and then hoping to extend their mandate for another 3 years. Also, gender action plan under the Framework Convention will be probably renewed. And then in 2025, to give that additional perspective, we expect then the new and third round of NDCs. The second one was in 2020, so this one is 2025, hopefully then informed by the Global Stocktake. And of course, we also expect new financial commitments. The current 100 billion per year pledge by developed countries is supposed to be met since last year. It was supposed to be met in 2020, but global finance fell short. I think it was like 87 billion instead of 100. And so the 100 billion should be reached by last year. I just read yesterday. So that's some late, but at least some good news. And these 100 billion goal, this will be ramped up by 2025. So currently the negotiations are starting how the new financial commitments could look like. And we expect them to be higher than these 100 billion that we pledged starting 2020. That is an overview of the different topics coming up. Hopefully that also some of them are relevant to your field of expertise and work, and happy to answer questions and go into more detail if I can later. But I want to turn to my third part at a COP. So what you see here, and many of you have been probably at different conferences, this one is probably the biggest one I've ever seen. And it continues to grow year over year. I'll get to that in a second. This is a picture from Katowice, and you'll see that the meeting rooms in the conference center were not even enough to house everyone. So to accommodate for the different negotiation sessions, they built extra tents outside, and also in Sharm el-Sheikh, we have seen a lot of additional new conference capacity built just to house everyone. In Dubai, will be hosted in the expo pavilions and expo grounds. So there is already much more infrastructure in place, but I expect there will be some shortage of rooms as per usual. Usually in these rooms, if you ever sort of listen into it, not all rooms are open also for journalists or observers, but some are. This is actually an informal consultation on transparency, and you see how big the interest is there. So you'll see around the table the different negotiation countries and groups. Here, if you zoom in, you can see Kenya and Egypt sitting at the first table. So the speakers of the different states are in the first row, and then behind it, usually the support colleagues. And then in third and fourth row are usually observers and additional people who want to listen into the negotiations. And at the sort of opposite side of the table, you'll have the two co-facilitators of the respective item, supported by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So they would guide through the session. They are preparing the draft documents based on the inputs they've received, and basically navigate these discussions during the COP meetings. And we have a lot of rooms in parallel, that needs to be said. So we'll get to that. If it's our first COP or second COP or seventh COP, you are not alone. It will be stressful. It will be full. It will be noisy because it's been gathering attention year over year. And this is from the UNFCCC website on the participation of stakeholders. And you see here the blue part is the parties. And last year at the COP27 and CMA4, you see that was over 20,000 party representatives present, and 12,000, over 12,000 from observer organizations, and I think 2,160 from media accredited, and from the global change agenda, additional several hundred. So all in all, last year, 36,674 people registered. Not all of them show up for the whole 2 weeks. Some are there for side events. Some will be there for the first week of negotiations. Sometimes it's ministers coming in only in the last days with their press staff and support. So not all 36,000 have been present for the 2 weeks, but of course, at any given time at the conference ground, you can expect to see more than 10,000 or 12,000 people. So it will be full. Just one thing to guide us into how the negotiations look in practice. There's always a chair. This is from the COP18, but the COP presidency will now be handed over from Egypt at the beginning of the COP to the UAE as the UAE presidency, and then they will be the COP presidency for the coming year. And the chair then will also invite for all the sub-items to have co-facilitators from different countries. So that's not necessarily led by the presidency, but by all different kind of people from the negotiation experts. And but all process officers here in this context have the role of a chair. So it still amazes me after all these years that all these high-level representatives from different ministries and also ministers, everybody sticks to these rules. The chair gives you the word or the microphone, and then you can have your intervention, and then the next one is in time. So it's a very, very, very structured and organized discussion, and that's the only way you can deal with this in a meeting with so many participants. But of course, rules of procedure are key. Happy to elaborate if you have any questions on that. We've had that slide before. Just want to recapitulate because now I want to talk about the meetings. When you enter the COP, you want to make sure that you are in the right room at the right time, and that's never easy, even for myself, because sometimes the rooms are well hidden, you can't find them, or sometimes there has been a room change last minute and you aren't aware of it. But also in the beginning, it's just confusing which room you actually want to go to. You might want to follow a specific agenda item or a specific negotiation topic or a specific side event. And all these meetings are taking place in parallel. So this is just the first slide of a few to show you how many meetings are actually taking place. So all these 5 bodies will be meeting. At the beginning, we have the opening of the plenaries. They meet at the end again to agree on the decisions. And in between, we'll have all the negotiating bodies under them. So that's already 5 bodies with 5 different agendas. Then we have the constituted bodies. Those are more expert forum. You see much fewer members. It's representatives between 12 and sometimes 20 that have been established under the UNFCCC. Those are the ones in orange. Under the Kyoto Protocol, those are the ones in green. And most recently, under the Paris Agreement, those are the ones in red at the bottom. So these meetings usually take place between the negotiation sessions, not necessarily at the meetings. But it needs to be remembered, these bring forward the work apart from the negotiation process and usually have their own work plans. So when we meet at the negotiations, these constituted bodies will also have many mandated events to implement their work plans during the sessions. So we'll have negotiation sessions and we'll have mandated events under these different constituted bodies. And as you can see, there are a lot and the number has been growing in recent years. On top of that are all the side events. This is the current schedule by the COP28 presidency. And you see they follow the example from other COP presidencies to group the different side events that take place into thematic days. So starting on December 3rd, health and relief, recovery and peace. On December 9th, it would be nature, land use and oceans, etc. So most of the side events would be grouped around that day. So that allows you, if you follow a specific topic, specific stream of work, you can, and are interested in visiting a number of side events, you can have a look at that agenda and make sure that you are there on the conference ground and on the right day. It also shows there will be the opening on November 30th, where all of us will be, because that's when the COP, the CMA, and the CMP will have the opening plenaries. And then the second and third day of the COP, the 1st and 2nd of December, is the World Climate Action Summit. So this is something relatively recent. I think just 2 COPs ago we started with that, where the COP presidency would like to give us some drive and momentum. So they invite high-level world leaders and prime ministers and secretaries of state to participate in the first 2 days and discuss their ambition, their commitments, maybe pledge to some new commitments. So that will be very busy because on top of all the negotiation, the technical negotiators, also the whole high-level delegations will be there in the first, on the 2nd and 3rd day. So the World Climate Action Summit will be sizable and also take a bit of the focus away from the negotiations. As a technical negotiator, I see that with a grain of salt, because in the beginning we used to have the first week among ourselves before the ministers came in at the end. Now we have ministers in the beginning to give us momentum and at the end to solve the deal. So it takes a bit away from the negotiation time because of course rooms are limited. The different delegations are double and triple booked. So it's difficult to negotiate when everybody's busy with the high-level events. But that's just my personal note. As a journalist and observer, you'll be jumping between different zones. That's a concept that has been introduced some years back. It's for security reasons, but also just for matters of managing these masses of people attending the COP. So the blue zone is usually the area where we have the technical negotiations. That's basically where I will spend 99% of my time. I can't remember if I've ever made it into a green zone other than one time at one COP some years back. That's going to be also just for accredited people. The green zone is a bit more open. That's more the space for civil society. So very interesting side events, actions and events will take place also in the green zone, but also you'll see there are different entrances. So I think it's the Expo 2020 metro station at the top. That will be the main entrance for the blue zone. There will be the security controls, etc. And once you're in the blue zone, you don't have to sort of show your badge everywhere. But as soon as you leave, you have to sort of, scan your bag and get out and in again. So for me as a negotiator who's busy jumping between meetings, I barely have the time to leave the blue zone, go to the green zone, go to a side event, and go back again through security. It just takes too much time. But you'll see the expo grounds are quite vast, and the blue zone and green zone have almost equal sizes. So there will be many, many events, and you want to make sure in which zone they are, so you can plan your time and distance accordingly. Because I think just remembering Sharm el-Sheikh, it took me sometimes 10 to 15 minutes straight walking time between meeting rooms. And if you multiply that with like 10 times a day, it's a lot of extra walking in between. That's not an error in your display. That is the daily program. I try to take the busiest day from the last year's COP and to show it all on one screen. And of course, it's unreadable. That is our daily struggle with the daily program, because I've mentioned now all these different types of meetings coming together, the negotiation meetings, the mandated events of the constituted bodies. We'll have the side events, also co-organized by the presidency and grouped. And all of them pop up in the daily program. So this was the busiest day at the last COP, and I think it was 164 events on one day. that is an awful lot and almost impossible to cover. So make your schedules in advance. Check the different side event database that are already online, so you can see already which day and which venue they are planned. And then check the CCTV or also the daily program online on the day again before you head there, because you don't want to find out that this has been moved and it's at the other end of the conference grounds. That will crash your schedule. So there's a web link to the daily program that looks like this. That's my actual preference. It's very straightforward, just one line per event, and I can easily search and go through the browser and find exactly what I'm looking for when I know my negotiation item number, and I'll find it immediately. Of course, you can also use the app by the UNFCCC. That will also at some point update the different events, but there it's more touch-friendly and phone-friendly, so you can scroll for half an hour to go through 164 entries. So for me personally, actually, I prefer the old-fashioned web version, but maybe that's just me. Before I come to close, I want to show you a bit insight into the hierarchy of meetings, so you know why we have so many rooms. And this is an example to come from the COP plenary at the beginning, when we open the meetings, to the end when we decide. So we need a diversity of opinions to come to a compromise, because we have unanimous decision-making. We need consensus. So in the final plenary, it will be always asked if there's any objections, and if it's not, it is so decided. So on that basis, you can navigate with 194 or 197 plus states. But to make that manageable, you need to go down and yeah, you need to have vertical and a horizontal split. Horizontal means in this case that you need to split up the different topics to discuss mitigation with the mitigation experts, adaptation with the adaptation experts, finance with the finance experts, etc. So you need to split up among the different rooms. But also in the hierarchy, it doesn't make sense to have 200 people per room. So it's tasked into smaller rooms, and that usually works because all the negotiations take place usually with different negotiation groups. So if you are a state that brings 5 people in the negotiation team, it's impossible to cover all the different 100 meetings taking place every week. So most countries are organized in groups. The EU would be one regional organization that I can use as an example. We are 27 member states, so we would have 27 voices. We pre-coordinate every morning and every evening to get us up to speed where we are as EU, and we have a position paper already agreed in advance. So we come to the negotiation prepared as a group, and then sort of only 1 or 2 people from the EU need to be in any given room to deliver our point of view and to be engaged in the discussions. We don't need to send 15 people or 20 people. So not all EU member states will be represented in all rooms at all times. And that makes it much more handy. And we have also, of course, the G77 plus China. We have the African group of negotiators, the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. We have the least developed countries, the like-minded developed countries. You'll see all these different groups in the negotiation rooms. And as soon as all major groups are represented, you can basically assume that you will have the broad coverage of almost all member states. But that also means that you can negotiate in a room with 20 people instead of 200. That makes things a lot easier. So going from the COP plenary down, usually you have a subsidiary body taking on the task. That's opening also on the first day and ending at the end of the first week usually. And then it's usually put into contact groups. Those are the negotiation items usually where you expect some decision to be delivered. And after that, another level are the informal consultations. And you can see already from the color scheme, the participation of observers and also press is somewhat limited. So green is no problem. So plenary is open to all observers, open to media, and on the live stream. The contact groups are usually open the first and the last meeting, unless it's otherwise decided. I think there's a good practice in many contact groups to maintain transparency and have an open room throughout these 2 weeks. So the contact groups are more often than not, also open if the parties agree to this. But then the informal consultations are usually without observers. There are a few notable exceptions. For instance, on the local communities and indigenous people platform, we had indigenous people's organizations in the room throughout the whole negotiation, because it was about them and with them, and we needed them in the rooms, of course. So informal consultations are usually which are not on the screen. So you will not find them on the agenda. So on top of these 160 plus events I showed you, all these informal consultations take place on top, but those are among parties usually. How do you find out what's happening? You have to be in the first plenary and the first contact group, because then usually it's assigned who leads these different informal consultations, who are the co-facilitators, and then the first meeting is set up. And after the end of the first meeting, the co-facilitators will share the information where the next meeting is and so on. So you need to be present and or on the email list from the secretariat for that respective topic to find out what's happening. Or you talk to party delegates who can share that information with you. If we find an impasse and something that's worth negotiating even more, then we'll dive deeper into it in informal informals. That also means that there's not even the secretariat usually present to take notes and organize the meeting anymore. So it will be mostly party representatives among themselves, and usually not even with the country flags, but really just trying to drill to the core of the issues and find consensus going forward. But going down the ladder always means at the end we have to go up again. So finally, we need to find a consensus in the plenary. And if you don't solve anything in the lower levels, the informal consultations, for instance, you might find some issues popping up in the plenary because they haven't been addressed properly, they haven't been solved, or parties want to make a point in the visible eye of the public. So if you hear some public discussions in the plenary, something didn't really go well on the lower levels of discussions. Friends of the Chair is like a specific a version of informal informals where only a few parties are involved if it's only an impasse among a few states and groups. On top of that, all the group coordination and bilateral meetings are on top. So we'll meet in the mornings, as I mentioned, at EU, and in the evenings as well. Same is true for the G77, which regularly coordinates. So that you can imagine adds a lot of talking and meetings to our negotiators' plate. And those are usually close to the public, of course. So ideally, I'll get to a close in 2 minutes. Ideal world, the first week would look like this. We have the governing bodies, the COP, the CMP, and the CMA of the 3 treaties opening at the beginning, closing at the last day, and the subsidiary body preparing the negotiation decisions usually open only in the first week. But that's the ideal world. It looks much more messy than that in practice, because sometimes the SBI and SubSI cannot close after the first week. Some things are still to be discussed, so they go over by a day, sometimes 2. And on the second week, usually then the ministers come in and the high-level segment comes in, where many ministerial negotiations take place. So then it's taken up from the negotiation rooms to ministerial negotiations. That's how it can look like in the real world. That's an example from my personal experience in 2018 when I was issue lead for the EU on the compliance committee under Paris. And there you see like how many meetings are there for just a single agenda item and on which level. So every slot there stands for at least 1 hour. And you see if we didn't find any solution on the informal consultations, that's the light red shade, then we had to go into 4, sometimes 5 additional hours of informal consultations to go through the text and find solution. And at the end, of course, we agree on it again, the contact group, and then it goes up to the plenary again. But it shows just the number of hours involved in a single agenda item, and most negotiators cover several. To close on 2 slides, the one is how text looks like. So if you ever happen to find yourself in a room where actual text is negotiated, don't be surprised to find a lot of square brackets. That means that there's no consensus yet. So party 1 might suggest an option how to name a certain body, and party 2 might have a different idea, and then you'll find them all in the same line with different brackets. And then we'll try to find compromise solutions to delete these brackets and find a consensus language. So if you find weird looking language or complicated looking language, this is why. This is a picture I took from the local communities indigenous people platform in 2017. And you can see there were lots of options in just a single paragraph, which basically meant the same, but we just needed to find the right wording out so everybody would feel comfortable. And we found it in the end, but it took us an extra 4 hours just to solve these brackets. And as I mentioned before, if something doesn't go well, sometimes you have huddles. That is when you are in a meeting and everybody at some point gets some time by the chair to solve it. Usually it's a few groups of countries who disagree on one major point or two. And to solve it, sometimes people are huddling and then actually talking, standing to each other, holding a laptop in the middle. You see myself on the right top part here. That's a smaller item on arrangement for intergovernmental meetings. Um, that's usually not the greatest way because it's less transparent and everybody's standing, and the people leading the discussion usually tend to be the ones with louder voices and more stamina. So it's not always, it's better if we solve it sitting and behind the microphone, I would say. But sometimes you can't avoid it and huddles pop up. I'll close with that slide. You'll be there reporting on many different aspects, and non-party stakeholders are indeed mostly observers. So they can have statements in the plenary. They speak in some rooms. Parties can invite them to attend in rooms, as I mentioned, but they're not accessible, cannot access with their badge all the rooms. That is key to understand. But of course, they can put pressure on national politics. They will also approach you to have media coverage. There will be a lot of different, streams, side events, etc., press conferences, info bulletins handed out, etc., and usually also demonstrations. But I'm not quite sure what the regulation will be in the UAE for that. And there are some ongoing discussions on the secretariat level and also in the negotiations how to improve on the participation. That's it. Sorry for the tour de force through the process. I hope I've just managed to be in time. Happy to answer questions, but also to have that later discussed on the panel. And hopefully you've gotten a decent overview and some foundations to think about before we dive now more into the substance with our next two speakers. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arne. That was very comprehensive and really going into detail. And what I liked at the end, particularly that you were giving really concrete examples how you are involved in the negotiations. That was one of the questions I had during the presentation. So I think that was very, descriptive and clear, and so I think everybody will have a better understanding. And now we have already first questions in the chat. One is, in light of the outlined priorities for the next 2 years, how do these align with the urgent needs highlighted by recent scientific reports on climate change?
Yeah. Sometimes they don't, I have to say. Sometimes, as I mentioned, the process is one of many. It's one puzzle piece of many puzzle pieces to push forward. And nobody's holding any nation state back to be more ambitious. What we do on the international state is sort of finding consensus, how we report, how finance is provided, how new funds are being set up. That takes a long time. And the urgency is there. So, for instance, the loss damage fund has been decided to be set up last year, and now the transitional committee has a draft how to do this, and it will be probably decided at the COP that it will be set up. And then it will still take a bit because with the large sums of money we're talking about, it just takes some time. So, unfortunately, there are some things that are not accelerated as much as we would like them to see. But of course, we are creating new structures, new procedures. That takes an awful lot of time. The urgent needs, I would refer that mostly to the national level, because that's something that the Paris Agreement cannot solve without the dedication and ambition from the national level. So that's, I think, something where media and civil society can exert the most pressure to increase the ambition.
Okay. I mean, now there's still a chance to pose a question. We're a little bit over time, but are there any further question? And please raise your hand or write something into the chat. Oh, there's a very long...
I'll try to scan it briefly.
Can you read that by yourself?
I will, yes. So will the reforms to the global financial system to support Africa and the just transition be an item in the deliberation? I'm not quite sure about the declaration, whether that will be endorsed by the COP. I mean, the COP is a place where we talk about a lot of additional initiatives. So there might be press conferences that could put a highlight on it, but it wouldn't be part of the negotiations per se necessarily. I'm not quite aware. Commitment of US-China, that is definitely key, but also something in the background, because they will then sort of bring that commitment to the negotiation table. It's nothing, I mean, bilateral agreements would not be discussed on that level, but certainly will be key to strengthen ambition from both parties, China and the US, in the rooms. Have the issues that So yeah, yes, of course. I mean, without US and China, the Paris Agreement wouldn't look like it does now. And also, for instance, Obama's and sort of last act in 2016 were actually to meet with China and ratify the Paris Agreement. So when you have the biggest emitters aligned on going forward and seeing the benefits of a green transition, then that definitely helps to push everything forward, because both in terms of emissions, but also resources and production power and financial importance. Without these two, it's really tricky to find global progress. And the global financial system to support Africa and the just transition, I don't think the Just Transition Work Program will be on the international level, and it's talking mainly about workforce and the just transition there. So it doesn't have a regional focus per se. Hope that answers some of those questions. COP28 declarations, initiatives heavy. How do we balance that with negotiations? It looks like that. The sort of political declarations are usually introduced at the beginning at this high-level meetings, as I mentioned before. And then some high-level declarations will be launched throughout the different thematic days. But that's something that the presidencies do on the side. But the initiatives usually don't have the same level of commitment or reporting or monitoring. So they are usually not as binding. And the negotiations are ongoing in the full detail that I've mentioned. So I would still say the negotiations are the core, and the initiatives, declarations, that presidencies decide to host during their respective COPs are the cherry on the top, but or the tip of the iceberg, if you will. But there's a huge underbelly of negotiation, and that's also worth sometimes reporting on.
Okay, there are no more questions in the chat. Perhaps I have one more last question, which is a pretty general question. I must admit, I belonged before to, let's say, to the camp of people who believe that COP is not, let's say, fast enough, and there's not much enough implemented and declared what is needed in terms of mitigating climate change. But I learned today that yeah, it's a bit different, and I understood particularly that let's say the process in place is pretty good as far as understood. So that there really is a good mechanism developed which is working. So let's say, what is your main perception of that? Is that a kind of communicative problem that the COP is seen more negative than it should be, or are there still, let's say, forces, nations, countries who are trying to prevent further progress? Or perhaps the third option, there's something what perhaps as a challenge for journalists to balance between that.
Excellent point. I think a bit of all of this. I think the COPs have been becoming increasingly bigger and bigger, because where the media attention is, of course, many projects, many non-party stakeholders want to also be in that light. Many advocacy groups want to be there. So this sort of circle of negotiations has been attracting so much attention, which is a good thing, but also makes it increasingly a challenge. So there are some shortcomings in terms of just managing these masses of people. There are many chances now to have hybrid meetings and virtual meetings, but still, you could argue whether it's useful to fly 36,000 people to a single place for several weeks. That's not climate friendly in its own right, but we are not there yet to have virtual negotiations. Some other treaties do that. We discussed that during COVID, but many parties didn't want that because it indeed, I mean, you all know that a personal exchange is always a very different thing. If you are in a confined space and have some limited time to discuss, it's a different thing than having an open-ended, never-ending virtual discussion. So there are some things to argue for these physical meetings still. Reporting-wise, yes, I think sometimes everybody looks at the final COP decision and then decides whether or not, like 2 or 3 formulations have been ambitious enough or not. And what you ignore is 50 or 60 decisions that have been agreed on, right? So there are some success stories you can find in the margins if you're looking for them, but sort of the broader picture, there are sometimes in the main narratives, some key examples where we fail in the last plenary to decide on something more ambitious, and that's the key and only center of attention for the reporting. So it is a challenge to give that background and constructive insight to this complex process. So I think that's both. It is a complex process. It's hard to sell. It's hard to investigate, but also it would also show some more positive elements. But I'm not going to say that it's the perfect solution. It's the best we have. And if anybody had a better idea, I think in the last 30 years we would have developed it so far. So it's the best setup we currently have, and we'll have to make use of it.
Yeah, thanks. And there's one more hand from Kennedy.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Arne, for that. Thanks, Arne, for that wonderful presentation. Honestly, I think you've done almost. We'll see at the end. Now, recently the media reports. I think during the pre-COP, a week or two ago, there were reports already that there were disagreements, there were lack of consensus at the negotiations. Negotiations. I don't know what that point, but I'm back now. Am I?
Yeah, I missed a few sentences, but I think it was about the turbulence at pre-COP and the lack of,
exactly.
of consensus there.
Consensus.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the pre-COP is usually held only for like 2 days or 3 days. So that's usually something which is hosted a few weeks in advance of the COP, where some high-level ministerials and ministers are going to lay the land, if you will, to see how we are at where we are at. But it's mostly a very sort of short time to talk mitigation, adaptation, finance, and all the different topics. So first of all, not all topics have been discussed, but of course, some of the key aspects. And yeah, I mean, there will be very difficult discussions ahead. As last year still, we're talking about the balance between mitigation and adaptation. For many developed countries, mitigation is key because we need to reduce our emissions. For many developing countries, adaptation is key because they need the provision of finance and means of implementation to make ends meet and actually implement some change. So this is all a recurring topic and recurring theme. And that's but it's always like this, and it's always will be hard fought in negotiation. But I think hopefully in the common spirit that we need to do more on all fronts and find some positive framing forward together. But it is indeed challenging because the expectations are sometimes very different, and also the experiences from the past. For instance, developed countries not providing enough finance in time, that has not helped in the negotiations as well, because developing countries have been holding parties then accountable and raise that point in every occasion, which is a fair point to make. But also, yeah, there are some key challenges where some states after COVID had been economically struggling. It's a difficult economy also for many developed country states. So finance ministers agreeing to commit billions in the future requires a lot of convincing, and so that's not easily done as well. But yeah, so struggles always there, also at pre-COP. We'll see them also at COP, but nothing I think that we could overcome, hopefully.